My grandson said, "You're just the reason my dad's always broke." So I became the reason he'll never see a cent. By morning, I'd locked the land into a scholarship trust. By sundown, I'd removed them both from every account with my name. They thought I'd crumble like usual. They didn't know I'd been documenting for years, and when they showed up with lawyers, the paperwork buried them before I even spoke. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Sunday dinner still lived in the bones of the house. The scent of roast chicken clinging to the curtains, the faint crackle of vinyl under each chair, the quiet clink of cutlery arranged just so. Joan moved from counter to table without needing to think. She'd done this nearly every Sunday since Troy was born. He walked in 15 minutes late, as always, talking before the door closed behind him. A cologne cloud trailed him, faintly citrus with something synthetic underneath. He kissed her cheek, barely brushing it, and dropped into his seat with a sigh that carried too much performance. "Traffic's getting worse," he said. "Small town, big problems." Joan didn't look up from the bowl of mashed potatoes. "Dinner's hot. Sit." He already had. 10 minutes later, Austin ambled in, thumbs still glued to his phone screen. Hood up, headphones around his neck, sneakers caked in dried mud. He slouched into the seat across from Troy, eyes flicking around the table but not once toward her. Joan noticed the muddy prints he tracked across the freshly mopped floor but said nothing. They ate without ceremony. Troy talked about refinancing, about a business contact with game-changing potential. Joan listened with the blank patience of someone who'd heard it all before and outlived every version. Austin barely touched his food. He scrolled, chewed, stared off toward the clock like the minutes owed him something. Troy set his fork down. "So, I might need a quick cosign this week. Just paperwork, bank stuff. No actual money, just the name. You know how slow they are unless someone with history is on the line." Joan didn't reply. She reached for a roll. Troy leaned forward slightly. "Mom," she buttered it with slow, even strokes. "It's not a handout, just a signature." Austin snorted. They both looked at him. He shrugged, not lifting his eyes. "You're the reason he's always broke anyway." No pause, no drama. Just words, flat and careless, lobbed like a casual observation. And worse, Troy didn't flinch, didn't correct, didn't speak at all. Joan set the butter knife down, gently. Her plate was still half full. She folded her napkin with deliberate quiet and rose from the table. "I'm sorry," Troy said, but his tone was automatic, unbothered, a placeholder. She began clearing the plates one by one. His, then Austin's. She only paused when her fingers brushed the ceramic still warm from his untouched chicken. Her hand hesitated, then steadied. No one moved to help. Troy resumed talking as she walked away, something about banks tightening their loan policies. Austin laughed at something on his phone. Joan turned out the light in the kitchen and climbed the stairs without a word. In her bedroom, the silence was thick, but not empty. She moved with ritual precision, slipped off her shoes, folded her cardigan, sat at the edge of the bed. The room smelled faintly of cedar. She reached beneath the bed frame and pulled out the old lockbox. It scraped against the hardwood like a whisper. She placed it on the comforter and opened it. Inside, years of forgotten promises, paper-thin lies, and proof. Receipts folded into painful symmetry. Overdraft notices. Forgiven debts never spoken of again. Letters she wrote and never sent. A picture of Miriam holding a baby Austin in the backyard, both of them laughing into the sun like they didn't know how short the moment would last. She picked up the photograph and studied it, not for what it showed, but for what it didn't. Troy wasn't in the frame. The legal pad on her nightstand had a fresh page waiting. Joan smoothed it flat, uncapped a pen, and began writing. Not a journal entry, not a note, a record, the names, the dates, the numbers. She listed them all without commentary or hesitation, as if naming the damage could strip it of its power. When the last line was filled, she stared at it. Ink drying fast. Her hand hovered over the lamp switch but didn't reach for it. Instead, she leaned forward and whispered to the box. Not as confession, but confirmation. "You will not bury me." She snapped it shut. The lockbox had weight to it that had nothing to do with metal or paper. Joan set it on the bed again, this time not with reverence, but with the steadiness of someone about to perform a forensic autopsy on her own life. She pulled out the folders one by one, each corner creased, each envelope soft from years of being reopened, reread, reconsidered. The quiet arithmetic of enabling. At the center was a manila envelope labeled in her own cursive, TROY, loans and promises. She opened it. It all spilled out. A cashier's check receipt from 1993, $2,000 for a house down payment. She remembered the conversation clearly, Troy's voice cracking just enough to sound sincere, telling her the mortgage company was being difficult, that he had the rest, just needed to show strength on paper. She had withdrawn it from a CD she'd opened after Miriam was born. It had been her someday fund. For travel, maybe? For freedom. Another document. A court fine for a DUI in '98. She'd picked him up from the station, driven him home, and quietly paid the fine before he lost his license. He never brought it up again, unless it was to mention how everyone drinks a little too much now and then. There were IOUs scribbled on diner receipts and napkins. Some were earnest, others practically jokes. "Oh, you big for the water bill thing, you're the best, seriously. Can't remember if I paid you for this, assume I didn't." She found the receipt for the snowmobile next. Not in his name, but hers. A loan she co-signed. He insisted it was an investment, a side hustle for winter tourism. She'd watched it rust in his backyard, half covered with a blue tarp that shredded in the wind. A glossy flyer slipped out, an ad for a home theater system. She remembered Austin calling her the night it was delivered, breathless with excitement. "You gotta come see it, Grandma. It's like being in a real theater." She had smiled at the time, but now her jaw clenched. That system had arrived the same month she had to skip her physical therapy for a pinched nerve. He had the money for surround sound, not his mother's spine. The file thickened with the evidence of small thefts disguised as need, overdraft coverage, bounce checks, car repairs. Every transaction logged in her handwriting because Hope demanded documentation. Austin's name began appearing more often around the time he turned 10. Field trip donations. Private tutors Troy swore were necessary, dental work Joan covered because no one else showed up at the appointment. And slowly, the tone of the "I owe us" changed, from apologies to assumptions. "Thanks, Mom. I know you've always got our backs. Austin deserves more than this town can give. You understand." She folded each paper with precision, stacking them like bricks. Her silence had built this house of rot. She pulled the legal pad from the nightstand drawer. Not the one from earlier. A fresh one, clean, wide lines. She stared at the first page for a long moment. At the top, in darker ink than usual, she wrote, "Everything ends here." Below it, she began her list. Not debts, not accusations, just facts. A ledger of enabling, named and numbered. Somewhere outside, a gust of wind swept through the pines. The house creaked like it heard her changing. Joan stood to stretch her legs and move toward the window. Her land stretched long and bare under the moonlight. The trees her father planted had grown tall, and beyond that, the acreage she now controlled entirely. It had never been about the money. It was about the pattern. And she was going to end it. She returned to the bed, gathered the pages, and tucked them back into the folder. But before closing it, she added one final line in the margin. "If they want a war, let them come armed with truth." The diner hadn't changed much since Joan sold her half. The paint was newer maybe, and the specials board looked cheaper, but the bones of the place still whispered her name. The bell over the door gave the same wheeze when she pushed it open, as if recognizing her gait. Ruby sat in the back booth, already sipping coffee like she'd been waiting 10 minutes but didn't care. Joan slid into the seat across from her. "You look like hell," Ruby said, but there was warmth under the edge. "I've earned it," Joan replied, then laid the folder flat on the table. "It's time." Ruby didn't reach for it right away. She watched Joan instead, the way you look at someone right before they finally jump into cold water. "Are you sure?" Joan exhaled. "I've been sure since the second he didn't flinch." Ruby opened the folder and began flipping through the evidence, the list, the receipts, the notes in Joan's meticulous handwriting, her brows knit tighter with every page. "He's not just draining you," Ruby said softly. "He's trained that boy to do it next." Joan nodded. "He didn't inherit the land. He inherited the hunger." Ruby's pen was already in her hand. "We'll start with the will." Joan pulled another slip of paper from her coat pocket. Older, folded too many times, but still legible. It was a draft from years ago, when Miriam was alive. Her name had once been circled as executor, but it had never been finalized. "She was supposed to be the one who kept it all honest," Joan said. Ruby hesitated. "You want to name her anyway?" I want to name what she would have done." That got Ruby. As attention, Joan reached for a napkin and wrote 6 words: "Miriam's Memorial Youth Foundation, Private Scholarship Fund." Ruby leaned back, lips parted. "You've been sitting on that name how long?" "Since the funeral." "And the land?" "Goes to the foundation, in trust, locked, forever." Ruby stared at her. "You're not just cutting them out, you're giving the legacy away." Joan didn't blink. They gave it away first. The rest of the conversation moved with surgical precision. Ruby outlined the clauses, filed the executor information, drew up documents for a trust under Oregon's nonprofit protection statutes. Joan approved each move with quiet resolve. By the time the waitress refilled their coffee, Ruby had drafted the bones of the new will. She flipped it around, tapping the signature line with her pen. Joan signed. The sound of it, just pen to paper, still rang like a thunderclap. "Now the land," Ruby said. Joan pulled out the second folder. This one was thinner but heavier somehow. It held a title deed, original survey maps from her father, and a notarized ownership claim dated 6 years after Miriam died, when Joan officially inherited it outright. "Zoned for development," Ruby murmured. "It's worth more than both their houses combined." "They'll never touch it," Joan said. "Not a single acre." Ruby drafted the transfer, placing the land into a protected charitable trust. Not a family holding, not an estate asset, no bloodline clause, no loopholes. By the time the waitress brought the check, Ruby looked across the table and smiled, sharp and knowing. "Joan Whitaker," she said, "you just rewrote your entire bloodline." Joan stirred her coffee. "Good. It was written in rot." She left cash on the table, no change expected. Outside, the wind was picking up, a long, low howl moving through the narrow main street. Joan's eyes scanned the sidewalk, half expecting a familiar shape. But no Troy, no Austin, just her reflection in the diner's glass door. Tired, clear-eyed, new. Ruby nudged her. "I'll file everything before close of business." "Do it by sunset," Joan said. "I want it done while the land still remembers it was mine." Ruby gave her a look but didn't ask why. Joan didn't explain. Joan hadn't walked the ridge road in over a year. The gravel had shifted some, looser now, scattered with pine needles, wild blackberry vines reaching in like they were trying to take it back. She parked just before the fence line and stepped out, boots sinking a little into damp earth. Her coat flapped in the breeze. The trees stood like old witnesses, taller than she remembered, arms outstretched toward a sky that hadn't decided yet if it would rain. She didn't bring anyone with her. Some things you signed alone. 14 acres lay stretched before her, marked by rusted stakes and an old barbed wire fence that sagged between posts. Her father had walked this same line decades ago, not with money in mind, but with steadiness. He planted trees, not intentions. Now it was zoned for development, already surveyed by 3 companies in the last 5 years. All of them eager, all of them dismissed. Joan stood near the tree line and took out a folded document from her coat pocket. The ink was still fresh. She read the line that mattered twice. "Property hereby transferred to Miriam's Memorial Youth Foundation, an Oregon-registered nonprofit trust." She didn't smile, but something in her chest loosened. Back in town, the courthouse was nearly empty. A clerk behind glass took the deed, barely glancing at her as she stamped and filed the transfer. "No associated beneficiaries?" the clerk asked. "None," Joan said. "It's a private foundation." The stamp came down with a final thunk. She left with a certified copy in hand, sealed, signed, unbreakable. From there, she walked across the street to Ruby's office. It took 15 minutes to update her power of attorney. Ruby filled in her name, passed the form over, and watched Joan sign. "No backups?" Ruby asked. "No backups," Joan confirmed. At the bank, she was recognized immediately. The manager greeted her by name, smiling like she was still the woman who used to bake pies for the staff every holiday season. "I need to make some changes to my file," she said, voice calm. He led her to his office and pulled up her profile. Joan pointed at the emergency contact field. "Troy Whitaker, remove him." He paused. "Of course. Do you want to replace it with someone else?" She slid a card across the desk. Ruby's name, Ruby's number. When it was done, Joan asked for a private vault. "Safety deposit box," she clarified. "New. I want it secured today." By noon, she stood in a cold back room where the walls were lined with brushed steel drawers. The air smelled of disinfectant and something faintly metallic. The vault door clanked shut behind her. She opened the small box with a key they'd just issued and placed her documents inside: the will, the power of attorney, the land transfer, and a photo of Miriam. Not a posed portrait, just a snapshot. Miriam on the edge of the riverbank, pant legs rolled up, laughing mid-step as water lapped over her feet. Joan had taken the photo without her knowing. She tucked it on top. When she emerged from the vault room, she walked slower. Not from age, from certainty. Outside, the sky had turned a darker gray, clouds bunching low like a bruise stretching across the horizon. A storm was coming. Not weather. The other kind. She got into her truck and sat for a moment before turning the key. Her reflection stared back from the rearview mirror. Steady, sharp, unshaken. She didn't think of Troy. She didn't think of Austin. She thought of every mother who had handed over pieces of her future just to be left with silence. The engine turned over with a single twist. Joan heard the truck before she saw it. The engine growled down the street like it was too big for the neighborhood. She kept folding the laundry. The socks didn't care about timing. The front door flew open before she could reach it. Troy stood there, soaked from shoulder to elbow, hair plastered against his forehead, fist gripping a paper like he wanted it to bleed. "You filed this," he said, voice tight. "Without telling me." She didn't answer, just gestured at the muddy footprints he was stamping onto her entry rug. He threw the paper on the kitchen table. It slid across the wood, stopping just short of her teacup. "You gave it away?" His voice cracked. "You gave away our land?" Joan poured herself a fresh cup. "You never earned an inch of it." Troy's face went red, then pale. He dragged a hand through his wet hair, pacing now. "You've completely lost it. Do you know how much that land is worth? We could have done something with it. Developed it. Sold part of it. That was the family's future." "You mean yours," she said. "And Austin's," he snapped. "Don't pretend this isn't about punishing us." Joan sat. Calm. She stirred her tea once, twice. "You're damn right it is." He stared at her like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You know what's funny?" she said, setting the spoon down. "You used to leave me voicemails after too many drinks. You thought I'd deleted them." She reached for her phone on the table, tapped once. The speaker lit up. His own voice spilled into the room, slurred and venomous, from a night a year earlier. "You think Miriam was perfect? She left because of you. You broke her. You controlled everything. I should have taken that land when I had the chance." Joan hit pause. Troy looked like he'd been slapped. "I didn't delete a single one," she said. "Not after the second time you used Miriam's name like a crowbar." "You're twisting it." "No," she interrupted. "You're twisted. I just stopped covering for it." He grabbed the back of a chair, knuckles white. You think this little trust thing will hold up? You think I won't find a lawyer? Hell, I already have one. Joan took another sip of tea. Then I hope he's ready to lose. Ruby doesn't scare me. She doesn't have to, Joan said, but you should be scared of how much paperwork I've kept. 30 years worth, including every check you never repaid, every loan, every time you walked in here like I was a vending machine with a heartbeat. Troy's hands trembled at his sides. His voice dropped. I'm your son. That ended the day you taught your son how to treat me like a bank account with legs. He stared at her, breathing hard, eyes wild like a cornered animal. I should have done this sooner, Joan said, but I kept hoping the man I raised might come back. Troy stepped back. He looked smaller now, not in size, in substance. I'll challenge this, he muttered. Mental decline, undue influence, elder abuse. You think that little friend of yours can protect you forever? Joan stood, steady. I'm not protected. I'm prepared, and you're decades too late. Troy didn't respond, just turned, slammed the door behind him so hard the window panes rattled. She walked over, locked it, and drew the curtain. Her tea had gone cold. She drank it anyway. Joan knew it was Austin before she even opened the door. The knock was too polite to be Troy's, too rehearsed. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, then unlatched the door and stepped aside. He stood there with a practiced smile, hands in his hoodie pocket, a messenger bag slung across his shoulder like he was visiting a professor. Hey, Grandma, he said, casual. Got a sec? She nodded once. Come in. He took slow steps inside, eyes scanning the living room like he was noting what hadn't changed, the framed pictures, the doilies, the hardwood scuffed from generations of moving furniture for holidays that didn't feel like holidays anymore. Sorry it's been a minute, he said, dropping into the armchair across from her without waiting to be offered. Things have been kind of tense lately. Joan sat, watching him carefully. He had Troy's smirk, softened by youth but just as empty. I wanted to ask about something, he continued. College stuff, FAFSA's a mess, and Dad's, well, you know. She gave the smallest tilt of her head. I was thinking, he went on, maybe there's something in the land value that could help offset our numbers, like equity or, I don't know, whatever the government uses to calculate that crap. Joan folded her hands in her lap. The land isn't yours. I didn't say it was, he replied quickly, tone light. I'm just saying, someday... It's not yours, she repeated. Austin's mouth tightened just slightly before the grin returned. Okay, got it. He leaned forward a little, elbows on knees. I just think it's kind of wild you gave it away. Like, a scholarship foundation, really? That's what you want your name on? Joan didn't blink. It's not my name I'm worried about. Right. Austin said, nodding. Right. I guess I'll just have to actually work now. He chuckled under his breath. Imagine that. She studied him, the posture, the deflection, the sneer he couldn't quite hold back. It was all Troy in a younger body that hadn't yet learned when to shut up. You remind me of your father, she said. Austin sat back like it was a compliment. She rose, walked to the kitchen. The kettle was already warm from earlier. She poured 2 mugs and returned, placing one on the table in front of him. He looked down at it, unimpressed. What is this? Tea, she said. I don't drink old lady stuff. You will someday, she said, when your body starts aching from the lies you've carried too long. Austin stood, brushing imaginary lint off his jeans. Okay, I came here trying to be civil. Just thought you might want to help me out. Thought you might want a real relationship. Relationships don't begin with calculators, she said. They begin with respect. He stepped toward the door. You really think any of this is going to stick? You think no one's going to ask questions when you suddenly hand off everything to some ghost charity with no heirs in sight? Joan didn't answer. I mean, come on, Dad's talking to lawyers. They think maybe something's not right upstairs. That maybe you've been, what's the phrase, unduly influenced. He gave her one last grin, sharp and cheap. I guess we'll find out. He opened the door and walked out without looking back. Joan stood still. then looked down at the worn stretch of floorboard near the entryway, the same one Troy used to jump on when he was 5, pretending it was a trampoline. She whispered to no one in particular. "Not 1 cent." She closed the door. The waiting room was quiet, except for the soft whir of an old desktop computer and the occasional flip of magazine pages from a teenager seated across from Joan. She sat with her ankles crossed, palms flat on her skirt, her gaze fixed on a framed print of a sailboat on the opposite wall. Ruby had arranged everything. Dr. Emery stepped out with a clipboard and an open, practiced smile. "Mrs. Whitaker?" Joan stood. "Just Joan." The exam room felt like a dentist's office, pretending not to be one. Warm lighting, bookshelves, a bowl of mints on the desk. But Joan had known enough people with masks on, friendly, professional, polished, to know when someone was actually listening. Dr. Emery was. They started slow. Questions about the date, the president, the town's mayor, then timelines, where she lived, how long, where she worked. Joan answered clearly, confidently. When the questions shifted toward memory and reasoning, she leaned in a little. "What do you think is the purpose of this evaluation?" Emery asked. Joan didn't hesitate. "To prove I still have the sharp edge of a mind that raised 2 children, buried one, and still remembers every lie the other told me." Emery smiled again, smaller this time, respectful. They worked through memory sequences, simple math, word associations. Joan joked once, lightly, during a question about short-term recall. "If I can recite the names of every woman who stiffed me on pie at the diner in '89, I think I'm doing all right." When it was done, Dr. Emery nodded toward the camcorder on the corner desk. "Final step, if you're ready. Just speak freely. Confirmation that you're of sound mind, not acting under pressure, and that your estate choices are your own." Joan didn't wait for direction. She turned her chair toward the lens, straightened her shoulders, and spoke. "My name is Joan Whitaker. I'm 72 years old. I am of clear and independent mind, and every decision I've made in the last 2 months has come from clarity, not confusion. I know who I'm cutting out. I know who I'm protecting." Her eyes didn't waver. "I am not confused. I am resolved." She ended the recording herself, then sat back and let Emery handle the wrap-up. Joan didn't need a summary. She knew what had just happened. By the time she left the office, Ruby was waiting outside in the car. A manila folder sat on the dash, already sealed. "That's the second copy," Ruby said, tapping it. "Original is locked up. Backup goes to our out-of-town executor tomorrow. That woman I told you about used to clerk in probate down in Ashland. Tough as a bad winter." Joan took the folder and placed it under her arm. They drove in silence for a while, through town, past the shuttered video store, the car wash Austin used to skip school to loiter near. Everything looked smaller, or maybe Joan had just stopped squinting. Back at Ruby's office, they faxed a cease and desist to Troy's attorney, then they mailed a hard copy. Then, for good measure, Ruby hand-delivered a third version to the firm's front desk, with Joan waiting in the passenger seat like a general watching her second-in-command deliver the first volley. Later that afternoon, Joan parked alone at Riverbend Cemetery. The gravel cracked beneath her boots as she walked toward the far row, not the polished new section, but the older one, where the trees leaned over the markers like guardians. Miriam's headstone was modest, unadorned, no clever epitaph, just a name and 2 dates that had grown heavier with every year Joan had survived her. She sat beside the grave and unfolded the letter. It wasn't long, just the truth. "I should have said this earlier. I thought protecting him meant protecting you, too. But I see now. Silence, let him rot." She paused. Let the wind read along with her. "I forgive you for leaving, and I promise, your son will never suffer under them." Joan folded the letter once, placed it under a smooth riverstone, and stood. Joan cleared off the dining table and began building a case with her own past. Receipts came first, some yellowed and curling, others newly printed from her home office, scans of old checks, emails she'd forwarded to herself just in case. She lined them up like bones, dry and undeniable. Next came the journals. She'd never been the Dear Diary type, but every time Troy had called in crisis, she'd written down what he said, not because she thought it would matter someday, but because the part of her that once balanced a diner's books knew chaos better when it was measured. She opened the thickest journal and reread a single entry. February 8th, 2015. He asked for $400, said it was for Austin's braces, saw a new sound system in his trunk 3 days later, didn't mention the money again. She copied it onto a legal pad, clean, clear, simple. Then came the texts. She printed the worst ones, some late at night, others right after holidays, all short-fused. You always loved her more. Maybe Miriam left because you never let her breathe. Hope the will's in pencil, Mom. Things are gonna change soon. Joan circled the last one in red ink. Ruby arrived later that morning with coffee and 2 sets of highlighters. I brought color-coded rage, she said, holding up a green and a red. Joan passed her the legal pad. You're not going to like what you read. I haven't liked Troy since 2004, Ruby said. Let's build your wall. They worked in silence for a while, sorting, labeling, binding. Ruby tapped a stack of bills Joan had set aside, medical expenses from the year she slipped on the back steps and tore a ligament, the surgery, the physical therapy, the medication, over $11,000 out of pocket. Did anyone even offer? Ruby asked. Joan shook her head. Troy sent flowers. Austin didn't even text. Ruby wrote that down. The next day, Joan knocked on the porch of an old blue house on Shady Ridge Drive. It took a few tries before Edna Morris opened the door, blinking into the sunlight. She wore orthopedic slippers and a long flannel nightgown, but her eyes were still sharp behind thick lenses. Joni Whittaker, she said, surprised. Now that's a face I haven't seen outside a casserole pan. I need a favor, Joan said. They sat on Edna's floral couch, the kind where the cushions never quite settled right. Joan explained what was happening, the legal threats, the will challenge, the accusations. Edna's smile disappeared. That boy hasn't worked a full year in his life. I remember when he came to Sunday school, hungover. I covered for him. Shouldn't have. Would you say that on record? Joan asked. For you? Edna adjusted her glasses. I'll say it in court with bells on. Joan squeezed her hand. One by one, she gathered the rest. A photo of the rusted pipes under her bathroom sink, a patch job she'd done herself after Troy said he'd swing by next week. She printed a dated receipt for parts from the hardware store. Another item for the stack. Then there was Brian Latham. He showed up at her front door in his paramedic uniform, a 6-foot-tall blur of nervous energy and quiet respect. Joan had driven him to CPR classes as a teenager after his dad got arrested and his mom worked doubles. I heard what's going on, he said. You need a character witness. I'm your guy. I'm not asking you to lie, Brian grinned. You helped raise half the kids in this zip code. If they want to put you on trial, I'll pack a lunch and make it a field trip. She laughed, and it came out softer than she expected. That night, Joan sat at her desk and stared at the growing folder. It didn't feel like vengeance. It felt like testimony, not to what was taken, but to what had been silently carried. She tucked everything into a binder and labeled it in black ink, Witness Material, J. Whittaker, if contested. Then she locked it in the same box where her daughter's birth certificate lived. The courthouse in Douglas County was neither grand nor humble, just practical. Joan had always liked that about it. Brick on the outside, wood-paneled calm on the inside, like it had seen too much and learned not to flinch. She wore navy wool, clean and pressed, the same coat she'd worn to Miriam's funeral, not for sentiment, for spine. The courtroom was already half full when Ruby guided her to the front. Joan's eyes swept the benches. Troy sat at the plaintiff's table in an ill-fitting suit, hair slicked back like he thought charm still worked. Austin sat 2 rows behind, legs splayed wide, phone lit under the table. Troy glanced back as Joan entered. His expression flickered, not guilt, not shame, just calculation. He was still playing a part. Don't look at them, Ruby whispered. We're not here to explain. We're here to win. The judge entered. Gavel. Case called. Then came Troy's turn. He stood and launched into it, voice low, trembling just enough. "Your Honor, I come here not out of greed, but concern. My mother has been declining, mentally. It started slowly, repeating herself, forgetting small things, lashing out." Ruby didn't object. She let him dig. "I've tried to be patient, but suddenly she changed her will, gave everything away to a foundation no one's heard of, removed me, my son, the only family she has left. I believe she's been manipulated by her attorney, pressured, isolated." Joan didn't move. Ruby's fingers tapped twice against her folder, a signal. It was almost time. "I only want fairness," Troy said. "We loved her. We still do." He sat, dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief that still had a dry crease down the middle. Austin looked up and smirked. Ruby stood, calm, ruthless. She handed the judge a bound packet, thick, tabbed, methodical. Then she walked to the projector screen and clicked her remote. A video began to play. Joan's voice filled the room. "My name is Joan Whitaker. I'm 72 years old. I am of clear and independent mind." Austin looked up. Troy's jaw tensed. The video ended. Ruby turned to the judge. "She recorded that 4 weeks ago, Your Honor. Certified evaluation attached. No mental decline, no coercion. What she did with full clarity, and a paper trail a mile long." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Ruby called Joan to the stand. She didn't hesitate. She spoke with steadiness, not rehearsed, just earned. "I gave my son more than most parents do, loans, bailouts, forgiveness, and all he returned was expectation." Ruby handed her a note card. Joan unfolded it, smoothing the edges. She read aloud, "You mistook generosity for a guarantee. You confused survival with loyalty. What I built alone. And what I leave behind, I will not have you poison." She stepped down. The courtroom was still. Next, Ruby called Edna. She shuffled to the front in orthopedic shoes and a Sunday best dress with the tag still showing. The court clerk helped her up the steps. "Do you believe Mrs. Whitaker is of sound mind?" Ruby asked. "Sounder than half the deacons I've known," Edna replied, "and they preach on Sundays." The room chuckled lightly. Ruby nodded. "Did you witness any troubling behavior from her son?" Edna's tone flattened. "He came to our church drunk at 20. He lied about tithes. He asked my husband to co-sign on a car loan and got mad when we said no." Ruby raised her eyebrows. "Anything else?" Edna hesitated, then pulled out a small envelope. "This is a signature page he left at my house 10 years ago. Said he needed a witness for his mother's refinance, but the signature line was already filled. It didn't match Joan's hand." A ripple went through the room. Ruby took the envelope. "Did you report it?" "Didn't know if I should, but I kept it. Felt wrong." The judge leaned forward, now fully engaged. "You're submitting that?" "I am," Ruby said. Then she turned to Austin. "Your Honor, we request clarification on the grandson's role here." The judge narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Whitaker," he said to Austin, "do you believe your grandmother is mentally unstable?" Austin blinked. "What?" "It's a yes or no question." "I mean," Austin sat up straighter, "she's old. People forget things." "Have you witnessed erratic behavior?" the judge asked. "She made a will and didn't tell anyone," Austin said. "That's not erratic," the judge replied flatly. "That's legal." He turned back to the bench. A long pause. "I find no grounds to support claims of undue influence or mental decline. The will is valid. The trust is valid. The defendant's claims are dismissed with prejudice." He looked straight at Troy. "And if either of you attempt to challenge this again, you'll face sanctions, and if I see another falsified signature, criminal referral." The gavel fell. Troy stood as if hit. Austin's phone lit up again. This time, he didn't touch it. Joan didn't smile. She simply stood, collected her coat, and walked past them both like they weren't even there. The hallway outside courtroom 2A smelled like old pine cleaner and nervous sweat. Joan stood by the window, arms folded, coat draped neatly over one arm. The echo of the gavel still rang in her chest, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Final. Behind her, the heavy oak doors swung open. Troy emerged first, jaw clenched, tie askew, skin flushed like someone who'd just been thrown into winter water. Austin followed a step behind, staring at the floor like it might give him a better answer than the one he'd just heard. Neither of them looked her way. Ruby joined Joan at the window. She didn't speak right away. Just passed her a copy of the court's final ruling. Joan didn't take it. "Anything in there I haven't already survived?" she asked. Ruby folded it in half. "Only the formal stuff. Claims dismissed, estate sealed, you're untouchable now." "And them?" "Troy's been warned. If he tries again, civil or criminal, it's on record. Sanctions, maybe worse." Joan's eyes stayed on the parking lot below. Rain was starting to mist the pavement. Not a downpour, just the kind that soaked you quietly if you stood still too long. "Legal fees?" she asked. "Covered," Ruby said. "Actually, not just covered, awarded." Joan turned, eyebrows raised. "He owes you $6,000 in costs," Ruby confirmed. Judge was sick of the performance, called it a manipulation poorly disguised as filial concern. Joan didn't smile. Not quite. But the corner of her mouth softened, like something old inside her had finally unclenched. Troy brushed past them without a word. Austin glanced up just once. His expression wasn't angry. It was smaller than that. Confused. Like he still didn't quite understand how the script had turned against him. Joan watched them go. Father and son, side by side. One wounded, one hollow. She turned back to Ruby. "I thought it would feel bigger." "It doesn't have to be big to be done," Ruby said. "Some doors close with a slam, others just click." They walked the hallway slowly, past the dusty bulletin boards and courthouse flyers that hadn't been updated since March. "Want a drink?" Ruby asked as they passed the elevators. Joan glanced down at the watch she hadn't worn in years but had dug out that morning. "Not yet," she said. "Later." "Coffee, then?" Joan nodded. "Black, and maybe something sweet." They stepped outside into the chill. The rain had become a mist so fine it didn't feel like rain at all, more like the air itself was remembering how to be clean. Joan paused on the steps and looked out at the lot. Her truck waited at the far end, exactly where she'd left it, just as reliable as she'd always been. She breathed in deep, then deeper. She'd won. Quietly, cleanly. But that wasn't the victory. The real one? She hadn't become them. Ruby sat at Joan's kitchen table with her laptop open, reading line by line as Joan reviewed a printed copy by hand. The words were simple, but she'd rewritten them half a dozen times. Not for tone. For truth. Miriam's Light Foundation, Private Scholarship Trust, Mission Statement, to give to those who never demanded, to honor the ones who asked for nothing and gave everything. Joan tapped her pen once on the paper, then circled the word demanded. She didn't change it. "Ready?" Ruby asked. "File it." The click of the keyboard was louder than it needed to be, like punctuation. Ruby turned the screen toward her. "Articles of incorporation. Filed. Accepted. Registered nonprofit. You're official now." Joan nodded. "And the land?" "Transferred this morning," Ruby said. "Final paperwork just came through. It's no longer yours. It's the foundation's. That means no seizure, no claim, no challenge." She slid the folder across the table. Joan ran her fingers over the cover, then opened it slowly. Inside were the stamped deeds, the updated county map, the trust agreement in dry legal print that made no room for confusion. Her signature was at the bottom of each page. Ruby poured them both coffee. "You really never flinched," she said. "I did," Joan replied. "Just not in public." They clinked mugs, but there was no need to toast. The act itself had been the celebration. Later that afternoon, Joan drafted a single announcement. Not for Troy, not for Austin, not for the town, who would find out eventually. It was addressed to one person only, Ms. Lauren Price, Academic Counselor, Pine Valley High School. Dear Ms. Price, please find enclosed a letter of eligibility and award criteria for the Miriam's Light Foundation. Beginning this fall, the fund will sponsor one local student annually, preferably someone overlooked by other systems, someone who works quietly, endures quietly, and still shows up. I know those kids. I raised one once. She signed it without flourish. The next day, a courier delivered it in a plain white envelope with a return label marked only with the foundation's name. No family letter, no Facebook post, just the one that mattered. Austin did post something, though. A few days later, a blurry photo of Joan's truck outside the courthouse appeared online with the caption, "My grandma was manipulated into giving away everything. She's not mentally well. Sad to see how the system fails the people who actually care." Joan saw it because Carla texted it to her with no message, just the screenshot. She didn't respond. Within hours, Austin's post was ratioed with comments. "Didn't you get a whole theater system from her once? Imagine calling someone unstable while begging for their money. Try a job. That woman gave half this town their first warm meal." By sunset, he deleted it. Ruby called later that night. "You see that nonsense?" "I did," Joan said. "It died on arrival." Ruby paused. "You know, you could do more than just scholarships. The foundation could grow. Community programs, youth trades. One thing at a time," Joan said. "First, I keep my promise. Then we see what light can do." Outside, the night air turned cool. Joan stood on her porch and looked out at the land. Not hers anymore, not in name, but somehow more hers than it had ever been. She lit the porch lamp. Let it burn. The bench was still there, tucked just off the walking path where the trees bowed gently toward the water. Pine needles had gathered in the corners of the seat slats, and the metal plaque on the back had dulled from weather and time. Miriam Whittaker, 1981 to 2009. She loved quiet places. Joan ran her fingers across the lettering, then brushed off the needles. The river beyond the tree line moved slow and thick today, dragging winter debris along with it. Branches, leaves, a bright red bottle cap caught in a swirl. She didn't sit right away. Instead, she stood at the edge of the bank and looked down at the water, remembering a different day. August heat, a younger Miriam laughing barefoot as she splashed across the stones, jeans rolled high, sunglasses crooked. It had been one of the last times Joan heard her daughter laugh like that. When she sat, she unfolded the paper in her lap. Not a letter this time, but a copy of the trust filing. Notarized, sealed, with her own signature at the bottom. She placed it beside her on the bench. Not for Miriam to read, just to let it rest. "I should have protected you better," she said, voice low. "From him. From all of it." She leaned back, breathing slowly. The memory of Troy's voice rose, uninvited. That awful Thanksgiving, 15 years ago, after one too many bourbons. The night he'd said what he always meant but never dared say aloud. She was always dramatic. She left because she wanted out. You coddled her. You let her run. Joan had been standing in the kitchen then, a knife in one hand, a dish towel in the other. She'd frozen, not spoken, not defended. Miriam had been gone 5 months by then. She never confronted Troy, never called him on it. Until now, she hadn't admitted to herself that the silence had cost something, too. "I let him speak for you," she whispered. "I won't make that mistake again." She placed a single wildflower on the bench, yellow, small, half crushed from the walk-up. It didn't matter. It was enough. She didn't cry. She'd already done that part years ago. This wasn't grief. This was goodbye. The breeze picked up slightly, lifting the edge of the trust document like it wanted to be taken downstream. Joan laid a small flat stone on top of it to hold it in place. She didn't have a speech prepared. She didn't need one. There was only the sense of something loosening, not gone, not erased, but let go. From the path behind her came the shuffle of small feet. She turned to see a boy, maybe 7 or 8, watching her curiously from a short distance. He wore a red jacket too big for him and held a stick like it was a sword. He pointed toward the bench. "Are you someone important?" he asked. Joan looked at him for a long second, then down at the document, then at the flower. She smiled. Just a little. "No," she said. "Just someone who finally showed up." The boy nodded like that made sense, then disappeared down the path again, swinging his stick at invisible dragons. Joan stayed a while longer, long enough to watch the river move past her, long enough to let the past do the same. The photos were all over social media. Austin in a navy gown too big in the shoulders, flashing a crooked smile, his high school diploma tilted just enough to read Pine Valley Class of 2025. He stood between friends Joan didn't recognize, flanked by Carla, who smiled politely, and Troy, whose forced pride didn't quit. He reached his eyes. There was no mention of Joan, not in the captions, not in the thank you speeches, not in the celebratory dinner that followed. Joan saw the post the next morning while watering her porch geraniums. Ruby had texted her the link with 2 words: expected silence. She clicked once. That was enough. By afternoon, she'd mailed a card. Not through Ruby, not couriered. Just the post office, regular first class, like any other grandmother might. Inside, handwritten in ink pressed deep into the paper, "Austin, earn your life. I earned mine. J." There was no cash, no check, not even a gift card, just words. And space to understand them. A week later, she overheard his rant at the gas station. She hadn't meant to. She was walking past the side of the building where the kids loitered after school, Austin among them, pacing, voice sharp. "She left me nothing, nothing. I'm her only grandson and she just, what, gives it all to strangers? She's out of her mind. That money was supposed to be mine. My dad gave her everything." A friend muttered something she couldn't hear. "No, you don't get it," Austin snapped. "She owes us. You don't just cut your family out like that. You don't just—" Joan kept walking. No need to be seen. No need to answer. That night, she watched Troy's snowmobile get loaded into the back of a trailer. The man buying it didn't haggle. He handed over a check and drove off before the engine even cooled. A week later, the home theater system followed. Then the boat. The pickup went last. She never asked where the money went. She knew. Legal fees, late mortgage payments, pride burned down to ash. The kind that still smoldered even after the fire went out. From her porch, she wrote one more note. She didn't address it, didn't even intend to send it. Just folded it once and tucked it into her ledger like a final footnote. "You inherited nothing, but I gave you a chance. You wasted it." She didn't feel triumphant. She felt clean, and that was more than enough. The guest room smelled like old linen and dusted pine. Joan opened the window first. The air that drifted in was cool and clean, scented faintly with Douglas fir. She stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching the light fall across the made bed, the faded posters curled at the corners, the uneven row of books still lined along the bottom shelf. It hadn't been touched in years. Not really. Troy had slept here after the divorce, after the first eviction, after that one spring when his business partner ran off with the truck title. Every time he'd left, Joan had told herself she'd clear it out. She never had. Until now. She started with the shelves, hardcover Hardy Boys, dog-eared sports almanacs, a copy of Hatchet with Troy's name scrawled in the front in green marker. She ran her hand across the spines, then began boxing them up. A call had already been made to the local library. She'd told the woman on the phone, "Nothing rare. Just loved." 2 boxes in, she found a yellowed drawing from 2nd grade, a crooked house, stick figures labeled me, Dad, and Mom. No grandma. No 4th figure. She folded it once and tucked it into the donation box without pause. An hour later, the shelves were bare. The closet, too. She ran a rag along the trim, swept the corners, wiped the baseboards. The silence wasn't hollow. It was earned. Downstairs, Ruby knocked once and let herself in. She carried a paper bag with lemon scones and a thermos of black tea. "You throw him out again?" she asked, glancing at the box near the door. "Just the memory," Joan said. They sat on the porch, the thermos between them, warm and steady. Ruby chatted about a zoning fight in town, a new vet who'd accidentally neutered someone's show dog. Joan smiled through it, nodding, sipping. Then Ruby reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder. "You ever just look at it again? The will?" Joan raised an eyebrow. "Not to change it," Ruby clarified. "Just to remember what you've already done." Joan held out her hand. Ruby passed it over. She opened the folder slowly. Each page was familiar now. Each clause, each beneficiary, each boundary drawn in hard ink. Her signature at the bottom was steady. She traced her finger along the line naming the Miriam's Light Foundation as the sole heir, then paused at the phrase Ruby had added at her request. "This document reflects not only my estate but my intent, that no obligation, spoken or presumed, shall supersede what is written here." She closed it gently. "I don't need to change it," Joan said. "I just needed to know I'd still agree with it." Ruby poured another cup of tea. "And do you?" "I do." Later that evening, Joan stood in the living room, holding the photo she'd kept tucked in the back of a drawer. Miriam, 17, wind in her hair, snapped in a moment of wild, laughing motion. Not posed, just radiant. She hung it on the wall above the fireplace. Not beside anyone, just hers. The frame caught the last of the daylight. The house was quiet but not empty. She stepped back, breathed in. It was the first time in years she felt like the house wasn't waiting for anything. Some stories don't end with a door slamming or a scream through a hallway. Some end with the turn of a pen and the sound of wind moving through trees that still remember the hands that planted them. Joan sat at the kitchen table, same one where Troy had once demanded co-signatures and Austin had once left his muddy shoes under the chair. The table didn't hold ghosts anymore, only purpose. Before her sat the second scholarship form. The first had gone to a boy named Evan, who fixed lawnmowers after school and never asked for help, but thanked the counselor twice when it came. This one would go to a girl named Kaylin, 17, in foster care since age 6. Quiet in class, not top of the pile, just steady, just there. Joan signed it with the same pen she'd used on her will. She sealed the envelope, stamped it, and set it on the table for tomorrow's mail. Outside, the light shifted. Dusk folded across the property in long, amber strokes. She took her coat, her walking stick, and stepped out into the cold. She moved slower now. Not weak, just measured. The land waited, familiar, barely changed. The fence posts still leaned like old men in conversation. The trees her father had planted swayed gently, a soft creak in their joints. Joan walked among them, one hand on the bark. She didn't think about Troy's voice or Austin's rants or the paperwork that had become her weapon. She thought about her father's hands, thick and dry, planting pine because oak would get greedy. At the center of the land stood a tall black walnut. She stopped there, pressed her palm against its trunk. It had survived 3 windstorms and 1 wildfire that stopped at the edge of the ridge like it knew it had no business moving further. This tree had been hers before the house, before the diner, before the mistakes she had kept feeding for too long. Joan leaned against it and took out her phone, scrolled to one name, hit record. Her voice was steady, quiet. To anyone listening, especially the ones who think time near me was supposed to come with a receipt. She paused, looked out at the acres below, now claimed by no one but purpose. I gave more than money. I gave history. I gave second chances. I gave the kind of love that keeps the lights on, even when no one says thank you. She looked down at the ground, uneven, imperfect, and still holding. And you threw it away. She ended the message and saved it under a folder Ruby had labeled, "For the uninvited." A copy would live with the trust, just in case. The sun dropped behind the hills, painting the sky in bruised purples and washed-out gold. Joan turned back toward the house, each step crisp over the fallen needles. At the porch, she didn't pause. She didn't need to. She opened the screen door, stepped inside, and set her boots down on the mat. She hung her coat, poured tea, pulled a quilt around her shoulders, and for the first time spoke not to defend, not to justify, but to mark it. A whisper, to no one, to everyone. You said I was the reason. She looked toward the photograph of Miriam, sunlight still caught in her hair. Now you'll never forget that I was.